So we're starting this session, this online masterclass. So it's the first time that the Sursock Museum and the Festival Ciné Palestine are in collaboration with the Toronto Palestine Film Festival, collaborated to organize this film program as part of the global festival Queer Cinema for Palestine, which is a collectively curated 10-day festival celebrating global queer realities and standing in solidarity with Palestinians. There are more than a dozen events happening across 5 continents, both online and in person. The festival started yesterday and will take place until November 20. And so we invite you to go to the website, to their website, queercinemaforpalestine.org, to look at the full program. And my name is Marie Noor, and I'm curator at the Sursock Museum in Beirut, which is a modern and contemporary art museum. And
my name is Anaïs, and I'm a member of the committee organizing the Festival Ciné Palestine in Paris. So the Festival Ciné Palestine in Paris was created in 2015, and it's a festival dedicated to the promotion of Palestinian cinema in France. Yesterday night, we had the screening in the Sursock Museum in Beirut and in the Cinéma Le Luminor in Paris. And the film program was composed of films made by Bassem Saad, Idling Congress of Idling Persons, Shuruq, Harb, The White Elephant, as well as Basma Alsharif, O Persecuted. So Bassem and Shuruq are with us today to discuss the films. Unfortunately, Basma Alsharif is not with us yet, but she might join later. Also, Islam El Khatib, who is a character in Bassem Saad film and who is a Palestinian feminist writer, might join later during the panel. So we will introduce our guests.
Yeah, so Shuruq Harb, who's here with us, is an artist, filmmaker, teacher, writer, editor, and publisher based in Ramallah. And her artistic practice focuses on online visual culture and traces subversive routes for the circulation of images and goods.
And Bassem Saad is an artist and writer based between Berlin and Beirut. His work explores historical rupture, social movements, and infrastructure through films, performance, sculpture, and writing.
Yeah, so we will start with
Okay, before asking any question to our guests, and then to propose to the audience also to ask their question, we asked the panelists to share with us excerpts of their movies because not everyone was able to see the films yesterday. So it's a gift they are making to us for everyone to be able to connect with the films and to connect during the discussion. So first, Bassem, if you would like to share your clip, please.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here tonight. It's so nice to be a part of the festival, and I will cut to the chase and share around 4 minutes of the film. The film is a total of 35 minutes. I'll just share 4 minutes that I think, all the characters that are in the film show up in those 4 minutes, so I thought it's a good choice. But of course, it can't speak to the rest of the film. Okay. It's working? Yeah. I couldn't hear a confirmation. Yes, okay, perfect.
هو ليلة اللي سمعنا خبر النبض تحت الركام من بعد الانفجار يعني، وليلتها انه كنت يا بقعد بالبيت ببكي، يا بنزل بتسكع تحت على قد ما في اقدم وجودي، يعني انه لعل وعسى صار شيء او بين شيء يعني.
بوقتها كان الكلب تشيليه فلاشي اللي لقت النبض.
هو انه بليلتها انه 90% رطوبه وهي موجوده
ونحن كنا كتير عطشانين، ما في ولا دكانه فاتحه، وكانت فلاش عم تتدلع وتتصور وتشرب مي وتاكل وصبات فلاش. وفلاش هي الدولة، الكلب هي الدولة. كان في هيك نوع من انه ايمان بفلاش، وايمان بانه اكيد في ولد صغير تحت هيدا الردم، هيدا الولد اللي ببيع ورود تخبى تحت هاي البنايه.
When asked as a child by a statistician, I remember saying something in earnest along the lines of how I would one day liberate Palestine. When I started volunteering and teaching students, I helped them conduct the same survey process. I learned that my students' answers were very different from my own. They were dreaming of having actual careers. Becoming a doctor was almost impossible in Lebanon, yet it seemed more probable to them than liberating Palestine or even dreaming of doing so. According to JANA statistics, fewer and fewer students have chosen to liberate Palestine as their end goal since 2007. And I would be lying if I said that this shift doesn't terrify me. What once was a collective imaginary becomes an individual choice. When you are not positioned as an actor with power or agency, you may choose to be politically active. In the early 70s, people demanded the democratization of UNRWA. They led strikes and protests because they wanted it to be a people's organization. Yet they were silenced, similar to how they were silenced since I remember seeing a man carrying a flyer that said, "Do not turn us into terrorists." And that line has stayed with me.
كانت بحلم حلم شي بخوف. حلم هي بكون مطرح كتير حلوة، بكون عادي مع ناس حوالي كتير حلو وكذا، تجي موج كبيرة كتير قوية متلوثة بالوحل، كلها وحل بني بني بني، تجي بكل القوة. أنا بركض لأهرب منها، لأقطع مطرح ما بتجي عليها، ما بقدر إنه لاحق أهرب، تجي علي تاخد حوالي والكل شي عالم بتروح، وببقى أنا لوحدي، إنه ببقى لوحدي بهدية بشي، خلص منقوز حالي. بعد شوي بروح بسأل الناس إنه شفت هيك مني شو معناتها؟ بيقولوا لي إنه بدك تطلعي من البلد. أوكي. فعلا أوكي، جيت على لبنان. بس حلم ذاته لحل عم بحلم، نفس الحلم، نفس المشهد، نفس الشيء، ما بعرف ليش.
Okay. So that was a very dialogue heavy excerpt.
Thank you for this.
Thank you, Bassem. Do you want to discuss a bit about it and to put it more into the context of the whole movie, and also to maybe introduce it as a part of this event?
Yes, for sure. So the Islam, who's in the film, I mean, might join us at some point. But basically, the film I made after, like, in the wake of 3 events, and they are the Lebanese uprising, the George Floyd protests in New York, and the Beirut port explosion. And it's kind of like, it ends up being a multi-author like film essay. And I worked with all of the characters that you saw to sort of workshop their scripts, rehearse, and they wrote their parts, and we deliberated on what's most important to show, and we thought of the scenography and sort of like the register of the dialogue and the character performativity. And so this is towards the end of the film, after they've kind of discussed, I guess, like more present oriented, like after they've discussed the events themselves, the uprisings and the protests, and now they're kind of reflecting on wider, like some of it is a discussion of dreams, some of it is more in memory. And yeah, like this is, the film cycles through the performers, and we see them, and then we drift away, and then we hear, and then their dialogues start to mesh with each other. And they, like, sometimes you hear recordings of the same sentence but said differently or said in different ways. And that was kind of a part of like trying to stage a dialogue and then seeing what slips out of it and what is lost in the delivery. And yeah, I guess that's what I can say for now about this excerpt. But
thank you. Shuruq, do you want to share your clip with us?
Yes, I'm gonna do I just want to read a few lines, the tagline about the film first, and then I'll show the clip, and then I'll come back and do a bigger introduction. But using images shared on the internet by Israelis during the Gulf War, the First Intifada, and trans music gatherings, The White Elephant composes the portrait of a Palestinian teenager in the 1990s in the mirror of Israeli pop culture. So I'm gonna show a brief, also, well, almost 4 minutes. I have to share it, share the screen. Share the screen. Yes, okay. When you take something apart, how in the world do you remember how it's supposed to go back together? Going in was easier than getting out. And once we got there, it felt incredible. 72 hours of musical madness. All I had to do was pretend to be an Israeli girl. People jumping up and down. Israeli soldiers love trans music.
I love trans music every day, every week, especially. I'm going to clubs and I hear it, and it's very, very nice.
Trance music makes me high. It's the kind of music today that makes the world go around.
This Israeli guy insisted we were witnessing history.
But actually, it felt like we were making history. He couldn't recognize who we were. I guess on the surface, we were all escaping something. He wanted to forget that he was a soldier, and we simply wanted to disappear. Sometimes it felt like I was just following Nasser. Even though he was the one chasing me. I was surprised when he told me. He was drunk and I didn't really understand alcohol. He said it only takes 60 seconds to steal a car. But driving the car back to Ramallah is the complicated part. He insisted he only stole from Israelis. As if that made it a noble cause.
how بتقولي حبيبتي how بتقولي جدا 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 how بتقولي سيدة سلطانة.
Did you ever think you'd live to see the day when a transsexual would win the Eurovision Song Contest? Well, she did, and she's here, and she's gorgeous. Would you welcome, please, Dana International. We were told that you especially wanted to come to Ireland because to you it's the home of the Eurovision. Not so. Yeah?
You're the #1 country that hosts the most Eurovision contests than any other country, so you deserve respect.
So it meant something to you.
And I have to say that it's not just that. I want also to congratulate Ireland for the peace agreement, and I hope in Israel we'll have the same sort of peace agreement with all our neighbors, and you should be clapping to yourself.
It looks like it. Looks like it. Did Netanyahu come to greet you at the airport? No?
No, Netanyahu was meeting Arafat in New York City. You know, they talk and talk and talk and they do nothing. But
we were told here there were
I'm going to
reports
stop it here. Yeah, so just to say that the film is narrated by the main character, who's a teenager, who is kind of delusioned by a loss of a friend in the first Intifada, and now is seeing a car thief who, despite doing what may be perceived as something subversive, by picking on the holes that the Oslo Peace Agreement created on the landscape, is actually is apolitical. And she's trying to make sense of the contradictions and the confusion of the Oslo peace process. Obviously the timing, and I feel really happy actually to be asked to share this program within this festival, because a big part of the White Elephant is shedding light on the whitewashing, pinkwashing of Tel Aviv as a party scene that has always been standing there for sexual liberation and freedom, individual freedom. And meanwhile, it actually is hiding a lot of the occupation's atrocities behind it. And this is very clear in terms of how Israel is part of the Eurovision suddenly. But they're part of the European landscape, but somehow Palestine isn't. But yeah, and I think this is a very important part in just the thinking about Israel as an exceptional state. You know, exceptional in terms of how forward thinking and liberated it is and using, you know, queer politics and identity to do so. But also just to say that, you know, electronic music and raves and their popularity within Israel and Tel Aviv becoming a mecca of partying was very important in the 90s, because this kind of emerged from the program that the Israeli government does. After the soldiers complete their service, they are awarded a year, and most of the time they end up going to places like Thailand and India. And that's actually how somehow that music became popular within Israel. And yeah, and so I just thought that it made a very interesting background, because that mode of escapism is also political, like the popular image or the pop image is political. And it's important to recognize, you know, images of escapism as also political images.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Yes, so Basma, I think she will join us in 5 to 10 minutes, she just told us. So we're thinking of starting with maybe one question, and then when she will come, she will share her extract, and we can then have a conversation, all of us. Yeah.
So our first question was about, like, it took us some time to find the title of the program. So it's Wakeful Rest, Voices for Palestine, or En veille, une assemblée de voix pour la Palestine in French. And with that title, we wanted to translate the idea of a community in a state of wakefulness, meaning the idea that rest and confusion is also a political moment, and a moment and the space of articulation of people and struggles while they gather together and act and protest in a rhythm that is usually associated with the absence of action. So the first question we wanted to ask you in relation to that to this title is how do you see the characters of the three movies and the work on the editing of the films in relation to the problematics of rhythm and articulation that we highlighted into the program? I don't know, Shuruq, you want to answer first, or?
No, have Bassem answer.
Good question.
Sure. So, I mean, this film kind of, oh, Basma, hello.
Hi, Basma.
Hi, I'm very sorry about that.
I knew it was the time difference.
I really checked it, and I feel like such an idiot. Thank you for writing to let me know.
Can we start then with Basma's clip, because it was so nice to answer this question with Basma as well.
Yeah. Okay. So Basma, I will just introduce you because we introduced the other speakers. Is an artist of Palestinian origin, raised between France, the US, and Gaza Strip. She developed her practice nomadically and works between cinema and installation. So yesterday we've seen your work, O Persecuted, who is work made with the process of restoration of the film by Bassem Hawal, with a film that was made in 1974. And I don't know if you want to introduce a bit more the clip before we share our screen, or if you prefer to talk later.
I mean, I can just say something briefly. The film is, I think, kind of challenging to watch. It's you spend 10 minutes in the dark, and the sound is quite aggressive, and it's a really visceral experience, and was meant as that very explicitly. So I think I don't usually like introducing it that much, because I think there is something that happens when you watch the film, and what you see in the excerpt is just it's very hard to pick an excerpt from this film that would be representative of what it is, even though it's quite simple as a work. structurally speaking, I guess, or visually speaking. But so what you see is just a little taste of what the film is. But just to keep in mind that if you haven't seen the film, as you said, that some people might not have seen the film, it's really something that is like an experience to be had in a darkened cinema, in a collective space, and that it was very much trying to deal with these iconic images from Palestine. So this film specifically, maybe we can talk, I can speak about that later, but it was really in some form like an aggressive act on my part, and how to deal with these like iconic images and the use of bodies in a very particular way through militant cinema, but then also through like, you know, advertisement and party footage. And yeah, what I'm saying sounds vague and maybe not representative in the clip, but yeah, it's better not to kind of over explain the work.
Okay, so I will share it now from our screen. Sorry.
الصديق المضطهد، غدا ستلبس البدلة العسكرية، عاملا وتلبس البدلة، مزارعا وتلبس البدلة، تلميذا وتلبس البدلة، فنانا وتلبس البدلة، ويضعون البندقية على كتفك شئت أم أبيت، ويلقون بك على مقعد قيادة الطائرة، ويزجون بك في أتون الحرب. غدا أما أن تقتل أو تموت بين اختيارين في كماشة الموت، موتان أسود وأزرق، أزرق وأسود، تموت أو تقتل، تقتل أو تموت، تقتل، تموت، تموت، تقتل.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to add something now before we
Yeah,
start?
maybe I can just explain a bit more about what the film, how it was made, and the politics maybe we talk about as we go on. But how the film is made is that I was commissioned by the London Palestine Film Festival to engage with a work from a militant cinema archive that they were amassing as part of a larger exhibition, and they'd commissioned a few people to directly engage with it, with any piece they wanted. And I came across this Qasim's film that I had never heard of, and I watched it, and I was completely kind of taken aback by it. Like in one minute, I'm like, okay, where's my rifle? I'm going. Like I was very moved by it. And another, I was really disgusted or not disgusted, but quite like horrified by this moment that we're witnessing, and mainly because of how the film sort of addresses Palestinians in that moment as having no choice but to engage in battle, and also kind of addressing both Israeli Zionists and Palestinians in the same way, as if they were equally kind of going into battle to death, you know, that this was the only solution, this was the only answer. And in the moment when I was watching this, I was thinking we couldn't be farther from that moment, just in the sense that we're completely not equal. And just the way that it was addressing the body as just this nameless, unidentified, like participant in war, like without exclusion, I think felt very telling to me, and how much what happened, you know, in the last 70 years has actually moved us so far from each other that we're not equals even in the sense of battle anymore. And so I started to really question what the meaning of, or the value of this kind of film is worth today, like in our lineage and our history as Palestinians, like of having access to this material, which tells us like, actually, like we have been fighting this battle for a long time with blood, through peace, and actually it hasn't like resulted in anything. And so I decided to apply a very kind of poetic, even though it's kind of aggressive, but like tactic, which was to film. So what I did was I filmed on 16 millimeter, the film projected on a wall that I was painting over, so that the film would slowly just be black so that you couldn't see it. And then I reversed the footage, and I asked someone to make a kind of soundtrack for that material, kind of describing what I was thinking about and how to make this act of sort of burying this film for good, and the sentiment of that moment in a way. And so what you see across the film is rather than a burial, and uncovering of this material. So it's the reverse action of the violence of sort of pulling this out of history and bringing it into the present. And at the moment where the film ends, then we go into a lot of just kind of like, you know, like this spring break, sort of like Israel, like hot girls on spring break. And the reason I did this is to sort of like remind us of how the body is used in a completely different way in Israel as a propagandistic tool to say like, you know, we're a modern westernized culture, our girls are hot, we have spring break, which is also a completely false representation of that culture. And so I was really butting two ideas against each other that are not necessarily what we think about in terms of like militant cinema, representation of bodies from the region. And this is also overlaid with like a very Orientalist belly dancing footage, just to remind us of also how we also haven't, you know, like the way that we think of bodies and female bodies in the Middle East also hasn't evolved enough. And so what you have is this kind of really violent uncovering of this film that meets the present and tries to kind of confront like what does it mean to be a political body? What does it mean to be a woman? How are these kinds of representations being used against us? And how all of this is also just part of propaganda image making. And where do we as filmmakers or image makers, like where does our responsibility lie in re-representing these kinds of icons or ideas about our culture? Yeah.
Thank you. I asked the first question, but I don't know if maybe you would like, because the three of you presented your clips, so I don't know if you already want to say something about each other presentation, or if I go back to the question I asked. Okay, so Basma, because you were not there when I asked first the question, I will just summarize the very quick question was about like from the title of the event, trying to ask how you see the characters of the three movies and the editing in the three movies, also in relation to the problematics of rhythm and articulation, in relation to the question of rest and the state of wakefulness as a moment and the space of articulation, as we tried to put it in the program.
It's such a complex, all the questions are incredibly complex, I have to say. I read them when you first sent them, and I'm like earlier today when I watched both films, Shuruq, so I had seen before Bassem, I hadn't, and I was really happy to get to see it actually. So I'm not quite sure, like I feel like there's a lot that's being asked in these questions. I mean, I think I can respond more generally maybe about how I see like the kind of connections I see in our three works, which I think work really nicely with each other, because there's so much about the kind of missing body, I think, even though we're seeing bodies and there's something being narrated, and the way that we're encountering, like, let's see, the stories within the films is so much about how the visual looks. And I think I really appreciate that in both works that are in the other works that are in the program, because it's really reminding me constantly that like what I'm seeing is not the truth, or what I'm seeing is not the final kind of like I have to sort of decipher what the information is that I'm receiving something very clear as information, and yet there's something about how I decode that for myself, which I think is a really interesting link between the three works, because of, in my sense, it has to do with this, the kind of iconic representation around, you know, what's happening in Lebanon, what happened in both in Lebanon and Palestine over decades is so difficult to get out of what we imagine. And so I think what the works do is try to kind of rewrite what that looks like, so that we're not coming to an immediate answer about the politics, about how we understand the bodies that are speaking, how we understand the spaces that we're looking at. And I think that's maybe something that's kind of common of filmmaking or video work from our generation, maybe, is to just refute the idea of fact and objectivity. And I think that's very clear in our three works. I don't think that really answers the question, but that was sort of what I felt like was a really strong connection in our three pieces.
Just something that I like, it immediately came to my mind while you're also, Basma, was describing how she made the film, and that her film, and she wanted to bury it somehow. And it also, I don't know, I was hoping also Islam would be here, because there was one sentence in the film, I mean, and in the clip also that you showed, where she's saying, part of what shaped who we are was not being able to find a body to bury. And this idea of what is being buried and what's being shown, it just kind of like came to my mind while Basma was speaking. And then also, I don't know, there's so much actually to talk about the three films, so I don't know where to start.
Bassem, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think what was interesting for me in watching all of the three films together, and also I guess the title that you chose, I wonder how much this was an active decision, but the idea of awake, or the idea of a vigil, is, I think, somehow recurs in all of the films. I mean, in mine, there was this, in my film, I was kind of actively, I mean, the title of the work is like Congress of Idling Persons, but then it's like, in a way, like the Congress is the kind of like the archetypal inverse of a riot or something, which is like the spontaneity of a riot would somehow be opposed to the systematicity of a congress or a round table where everyone has equal footing and there's a discussion being had. And in some way, different types of like assemblies come up through the films. Like there's the rave, there's the riot, there is the mourning, the vigil, and there's the, like ironically, there's the Congress. And I think that's sort of how I approached the film. Like I was trying to make this film in late 2021, and there was no way I could think of making a film myself by trying to articulate like an essayistic approach. Like I didn't have the distance from the events that had taken place, and no one did. And so there was like this kind of the dialogues are very fragmented. It's very like no thought really finds its conclusion. And then my idea was to just find a way to get these dialogues together, but even somehow in how they're delivered, none of like even the relationship between the documentary subject and myself is very different in each case of all of the performers. Like in Islam's case, she kind of scripted her own, like she's reading from a teleprompter, she's performing this role. In Ryan and Sandy's case, it's more improvised. In Mekdis's case, like it was the least kind of scripted. So like even the people themselves, like formally, they're not in a way like they're not engaging with each other on equal footing, or even what they're saying can kind of aren't very congruent with one another. So that was kind of my approach, and then to see the rave kind of pop up in a way that's very ironic in both films was really interesting for me in terms of like a form of assembly or something. I think that's a thread that I picked up on that I'm very interested in.
Yeah, and I would say, Yani, just maybe to say about, because your question was specifically about editing. For me, I tried to edit the film in fragments, almost to kind of mimic how actually memory works, or how sometimes also we can trip on when we're even trying to tell a story to someone who's right across from us. But I wanted that fragmentation to mimic the kind of the taking apart of the body that's represented by the car, that also becomes something else, but also it mimics the fragmentation of the landscape that was imposed on Palestine due to the peace process. In terms of, if I speak about the character specifically, in the beginning, when I started making the film, I honestly was thinking that the main character would be a man. And then it was very hard to have them have these car thieves speak to me directly. So it was always mediated conversations, someone, I would ask, and then I would never direct contact. But then I also realized that, that many girls had dated car thieves. And if I couldn't access maybe the man, I could access the girls. And I was more curious about their, point of view. And that's when I realized, okay, so like in the beginning, you think that the guy is the more thrilling character, but actually hearing that the point of view of the girl is actually what's not expected. And she's actually the missing person, the missing person in terms of how people imagine these scenarios. And I really like this idea that, the inscribing of her presence through voice, because it's very similar. These rave parties or these escapist scenes within Israel, they would exist kind of like almost to delete or to erase or somehow make invisible the Palestinian presence. And I like this idea of making clear or making visible the presence through the narration, and the appropriation through her narration and the appropriation of the footages, which I believe also happens in Basma's film as well. Maybe less so in yours, but I think that there's also something similar in terms of assembling different, events. I feel there's a similar thing in terms of the fragmentation, also in terms of narrating a story in your film as well. Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question for you that's more about the time of the revolution. So it's all, for me, all of the films deal explicitly or implicitly with this idea of revolution or counter-revolution. And so one of the characteristics that we got to experiment during our revolution, during the Lebanese revolution, was the suspension of time that I felt that was like a good indicator that really it was a revolution happening. But if we consider that revolution is a process, is a long process, and thus there is no definite end date also, and we cannot think it in terms of binary, like defeat and victory, especially. And so but we have to recognize still that we're outside of the suspension now. And we're in a time that is also being transformed and impacted by late capitalism and its attraction and the division it creates. So my question is, do you think that these three films are addressing directly this moment by being critical, by being a critical reflection of this time and by highlighting it directly as a type of siege? Yeah. So I don't know who wants to answer. Or if there's something you didn't understand in the question also.
Maybe you can say more about what you mean by siege.
Yeah, so it's taken from the film of Bassem, where you feel like, okay, there's a revolution happening, but there's like force that are not sometimes very visible that are countering this revolution. So one of these forces, of course, like late capitalism and what it does to our sense of time. So like how it breaks, for example, the suspension, how it forces us. And I think it's very clear in like, for example, post-Oslo Palestine. I think that's why your film resonates so much with I think also the film of Bassem in a way. So yes, and of course this kind of seductiveness of this late capitalism and everything it offers that Israel knows so well how to use. But you can say also.
I can speak a bit about the siege because I feel like I'm the one who threw this onto the. I mean, for me, the siege, I've been like really interested. Like the first thing I can think of is after the explosion, kind of the official rhetoric that very bizarrely started happening was like the president said that. Lebanon was starting to undergo some sanctions by the international community, because of like growing Hezbollah influence in Lebanon. So there was like the president and Hassan Nasrallah, sort of their rhetoric was that somehow the explosion had lifted the siege on Lebanon. Like somehow there would be humanitarian aid would flow into the country, and this would break the siege that was the sanctions. And so I'm thinking generally of like this kind of besieged mentality, like the besieged mentality that regimes that position themselves as anti-imperial often espouse, like whether it's Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah, like there is kind of this idea of being a counter-hegemonic force that becomes official state rhetoric, and we're constantly besieged. But there's also the siege that happens, like that the regime enforces on its own peoples, like in a protest or something. Like the idea was also, I was thinking kind of the Syrian civil war and thinking of the experiments in self-governance that happened in Zabadani or Qusayr, and like how those liberated towns underwent like extended periods of besiegement by the regime. But there's like kind of a continuum of the siege. So even like very simple protests are kettled, and then like the protesters within are kind of, for a moment in time, are besieged and can't escape. And so I was kind of like, as a form, I was thinking of the siege throughout the film. But I think Basma, was really interesting is you said how there was like, you felt a kind of repulsion towards the original film, because like the revolutionary moment that the film was being produced in was not when you were kind of experiencing it. So it felt like even, I mean, of course here there's more like the duration is quite significant. It's not like me and the other people in the film looking back on a few months ago when we were really excited as part of a revolutionary event. This is more like a several decades long gaze. But yeah, like I am interested kind of in like the shifting of time between like revolutionary time and non-revolutionary time. And again, like going back to the Syrian example, like I always go back to the Syrian dissident Omar Aziz and how he spoke about like there's the time of the uprising and the time of the regime, and like the affects one has instantly towards certain events are very different in both. Like even like yeah, if we just look back on like the videos or like the texts we were writing during the protests, like you feel instantly alienated from them because it's a completely different moment. And there is kind of that aspect in the film, like all the interlocutors look back on this moment of uprising and there is a kind of distance towards it. It's not the same temporality they occupy in the present. That's kind of what I was thinking of. Regards to the siege.
I think it's also, I mean, it's not relating to the siege, but just as you're speaking, like the point of like where you are in relation to this moment of revolution is like even within, I think that's what's interesting in the film, like it's never that clear. Like there's this moment in your piece, Bassem, where like, I guess it's only one character, no, it's two characters who are describing like their, I don't know what to call it, like their right to participate in a particular revolution, which I feel is so great that it gets talked about, because I think for a lot of like areas of conflict that have this perpetual like, you know, cycle of like violence and like relative calm when things are still broken, that like there's also this experience of like, you know, who comes to kind of in alliance to something and then how they leave and their connection and also not wanting to say that like, but you know, everybody has a right to protest, like even if you're not from that place, but actually how complicated it is, like in describing the revolutions in Cairo, but also describing like one character saying like my skin was too black, I guess, to protest like in this, or I didn't have a right, or they're just waiting for me to leave. Like I think also the idea that revolution is just a moment is completely false, that it's this constant like a constant shift that's happening. I think that's also being addressed, I think, visually in all three works. Like mine isn't dealing with just like a specific, I mean, of course it is, but it's not like addressing, it's kind of addressing, it's not me, it's Qasim who's addressing this, like what the response is, as if this is something that's just in a bubble that doesn't exist within the reality of time and the complicated nature of who you are in relation to that moment. So I think like also trying to respond to like a political, like how, I don't even know how to describe this, I guess, but because I think that's what the films are doing, is they're stepping outside of a time and they're more just examining like the layers involved in revolution, or like what happens around a revolution rather than what is happening through time within revolution or revolt. I don't know if that makes any sense what I'm saying, but just that I think like in terms of not politics, but in terms of visual material, I think what the films are doing is kind of resisting having to answer to a specific like politics, or I don't know, not answer to specific politics because they are political, but they're not answering any questions in relation to the topics that they're like covering.
But also, I mean, I don't remember who said this. Maybe it was in the introduction or probably in the discussion before we opened it to the public. It's just that, I mean, to think when a revolution starts or when it ends, and what is manifested as the visual time of the revolution is actually not where all of the revolution is taking place. Because even when, I mean, when it has been, how do you say, when they have succeeded to disband people from the public sphere, right? It's not that nothing is going on. Actually, probably more is going on during that time. I was also speaking, like in terms of the white elephant, that the peace process, especially when it started in the 90s, it was a place of confusion. And I think Oslo remains confusing. I would say confusing in terms of how it configured the landscape, but also it's made it hard to kind of, all of our attempts since then, I mean, I would say like Harb al-Akhira, the last thing that happened in May, it's kind of like trying to get back that collective body again and try to bring back power to the people. And have agency within the political conversation. And if you notice, like it was called First Intifada, Second Intifada. I mean, and then there was another one, the third, the one. So it almost signifies, for me, it's all still one mode, right? And what they are trying to do is making it harder to speak about it. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think like also, I guess what you're talking about, Shuruq, like is kind of how we narrate or what kind of fictions we decide to apply to particular historical events. And like, for me, like what was important in making the film, I mean, now we're watching the film in a festival about Palestine, but I was thinking of like, I was making the film about the uprising in Lebanon, and like what is definitely not accounted for in Lebanon is that the fact that the October uprising, the Lebanese one, was preceded by like a summer of revolt in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon because of the labor, the change in labor regulations. And so for me, it was like, how do I make a film that is still like trying to have some kind of like expansive grasp on the event, but narrating it through like the figures that aren't at all in like the dominant, even like the dominant liberal left perspective on the uprising in Lebanon, like the Palestinian kind of uprisings in the summer before that aren't at the center of it in any way. Like they're seen as like completely different events or phases. And so for me, like, and it was like how to insert that at the core of the Lebanese quote unquote uprising, and even like factoring in for the presence of migrant workers who were present in the protest. So yeah, like I'm always very interested in kind of like when we decide that things have ended or have begun, or how we periodize things.
But it's also like, just to say, I also, like Basma, appreciated that conversation about how they went in solidarity to Cairo to join the protests. I mean, it's great that they even have this possibility. I mean, I think most Palestinians, we don't even have it, but it just it just reminded me of a sentiment that for us, that was all of our revolution, right? Like a lot across the Arab world, we felt this was also, you know, ours, that the Egyptian revolution was ours, even though that we didn't necessarily understand particularly what was happening in Egypt. And we didn't actually really understand the nuances of the complexities of the political, but we felt a deep sense of not even just solidarity. It was, this is just my impression. And I felt the same thing when it was happening in Lebanon as well. That again, I think we've seen all of these things also in connection with each other within the same timeline. And I think maybe in the past, we've always viewed Palestine as an exceptional state, or the only place of resistance that also offered other people from the Arab world places of hope or resistance as well. But I think in a way, somehow now we're kind of in all this mixed together. Did they disappear, or?
We're running the show.
I think so, yeah. It's gone rogue.
Are we talking?
Keep going, keep going, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, that's also like, I think what I appreciate is that Palestine is no longer just used as a symbol for resistance and an exceptional one within our region, but in many ways that we're all part of the same narrative. And when you take a break, somebody else tries to, like, especially I would say the last 15 years, yeah. Yeah, and Tunis takes a break, something happens here, you know what I mean? and yeah, and I think it's very important that we speak about the internal, the multiplicity of the identities, right? And that's, again, it shows up in your film, of who is currently in Lebanon, and, that it's not just in national terms. Yeah. So shall we keep going?
I know before Marie Noor and Anis left, hopefully they come back. They did mention that they were going to ask folks from the audience if they want to ask any questions. So if anybody in the audience, any participant would like to ask a question, you can either write it in the chat or you can use the little raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will unmute you and you can ask your question that way. But otherwise, folks can keep talking as well while we wait for people to ask their questions.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's actually, I just keep thinking about with these webinars, how the participants' bodies are not here, like I think it does create a clarity when I'm on the receiving end of such formats. In a way, I kind of feel relieved that I'm not popping up anywhere. But at the same time, I feel like when I'm the one doing the webinar, I'm like, well, how do I know that there's someone on the other end of the screen?
Yeah, well, someone's writing that they're enjoying the conversation.
Glad you are.
Yeah. It was really nice to, sorry?
Yeah, please continue.
No, I was thinking it was really nice to see these three films together, that I think I've also sometimes, like, with my film with O Persecuted, that it's such a weird film to program because it's so just like aggressive, and that oftentimes it's programmed based on, like, in connection to maybe like visual elements or just because it's Palestine or something. And I mean, here I felt like, I mean, obviously it's within the Palestinian context, but then it's really nice to see it placed in the problematics, I think, of like the visual imagery relating to revolution. Because I think I also just recognized it with your film, with Bassem, with your film, that I hadn't actually seen much, like, because I got off social media and I don't watch the news. I mean, I read a bit, and I just realized, like, I've only been reading things and I hadn't seen any imagery, and it was actually really nice to encounter it for the first time in this format, which just like prevented it from being this like fixed image that is unquestionable. Like the whole thing is questionable, like this moment of the people who are getting married and the guy with the, I think is what I'm assuming, with the guy with the flag. And I just thought, like, if only we could approach these moments, because also the kind of the danger of, like, not revolution, but like how revolutions are mediatized is that they are sensationalized in a way that actually sometimes like counters what the event actually is. Like, it produces something that is far from the reality of the everyday. And I think your film kind of helps to like disrupt that idea, because it immediately just like unromanticizes and complicates, and it's not pessimistic, but it's actually just very realistic in a way about how, about like the mechanisms that work in these moments that we're in ourselves often trying to understand, whether we're outside or inside. I think it's very similar, like how we relate to what's happening and how we understand what's happening, and how quickly the media works to form an idea based on how things are being recorded. And I think there's a very strong push towards like in your film to dislodge that, to make that impossible, actually, which is really powerful. Yeah. I mean, I'm curious now that you guys are back, Marie Noor and Anais, is why the question of late capitalism is coming up so strongly. Because I think I actually didn't feel I don't know that I feel that it's so present in the three of our works, or that there's any relationship to that. I mean, obviously that's present in our worlds, but I didn't read it as something that's there. And so I'm just wondering what the curiosity is about that term, that force, in relation to our works. Maybe you see something that I at least don't see.
I think part of the answer, from me at least, is also linked between like the question of incorporation and pinkwashing to the way late capitalism is working in incorporating possibly everything, like every discourses, for example. So for me, it's part of the answer. Actually, sorry, we were interrupted by internet, obviously, but yeah, like when you talked about the relationship between all of the films, if it's not the question of late capitalism, like the way you introduced the relationship as linked to the question of representation per se. I think also talking about that incorporation, for example, if I go back to the idea that, for example, queer cinema, and it's a queer cinema for Palestine, so I wanted to ask this question, if we can like describe queer cinema or characterize queer cinema as a cinema who is not merely rely on mimetic representation, for example, and it's a link between queer cinema understood in that definition by Barbara Menel, for example, and experimental cinema, for example. I wanted, like, I add this question, but it's just I'm trying to make the links between the question you addressed me and the question I want to address to you about like this question of incorporation and the act of representation as a way to convert this possibility that late capitalism has to incorporate different type of discourses, for example. You see what I mean? I think as there is another answer to the question of why we put late capitalism so much. I think it's also related to the way we've seen the film of Bassem, I think, for me at least. But
yeah, I mean, for me it was both from Bassem and Shuruq mainly, but also I guess like how late capitalism, exactly like you were saying, first is able to incorporate any type of discourse, critics, yeah, like and then you have again to produce another critic to like resist this, so you're like kind of running after it, you know, in a way, and how it transformed time. So yeah, so how, yeah, so that was cool. We were thinking of opening.
I don't know. Maybe one of you want to add something about this and about late capitalism, or the question that's now addressed to us.
I always go ahead. No,
No,
go ahead.
please, you go ahead.
No, go ahead, because I'm still thinking.
Yeah, I mean, like it's, I mean, like of course, like it's, I mean, I do want like, I am very kind of ideological, like I'm not, I mean, like the film has like whatever, like a communist politics or something, but I want to, I mean, in Lebanon, like for sure it was, I guess if you want to talk about like uprisings, I mean, they're all happening in late capitalism, but like Lebanese uprising specifically is like related to like financialization and like the bank, like the bank sector. So in a way, like the Lebanese uprising is very indicative of like other struggles, or like kind of continuous with a lot of other struggles at the moment. Maybe like you could, maybe like right now like sometimes the Palestinian struggle is thought of as like a national cause, which is not exactly, of course, like not the right framework, but yeah, which is why I was just kind of like thinking, like if you think of the Palestinian labor in Lebanon, like it is of course like kind of very indicative of like labor that comes out of a surplus population under late capitalism. Like it's very much that, which is probably different than like, and in a way, like it's interesting to think of the Palestinian struggle within Lebanon, like its particular intricacies and how it's different from the Palestinian struggle more broadly. Like also kind of the discourses that the Lebanese state reiterates to deprive Palestinians of like better working conditions or better labor rights. They're always along the lines of no, we believe in the Palestinians' right to return, which is why they've been refugees for like several decades, and which is why they continue to be like some kind of reserve army of labor within Lebanon, like within the Lebanese economy, like that continues to be a thing. So it's interesting to think of what struggles are thought of as like, oh, this is like a struggle within late capitalism, and what struggles are thought of as being more like along ethnic or national lines, when kind of like both are very much obfuscations of the nature of struggle in general.
I was
very long-winded, but yeah.
No, it's actually, I mean, I was just gonna say I thought more about neoliberalism than late capitalism per se, but I mean, I can speak about this. It's not really in my film, but in general, I mean, I think we have an issue about labor also within Israel as well. That, you know, we have this constant, we have a relationship, right? Where, you know, there is not trespassing, there is movement, you know, between these areas, because Israel relies on Palestinian labor still very much. But I mean, I guess that was the only thing that I thought, but I can't think of anything in relation to my film per se.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in Palestinian politics, but I feel like in some way, especially in the internal politics, it's starting to resemble a lot of what's happening in Lebanon, in the corruption, in the mixture of private-public partnership, for example.
Absolutely.
And the fact that there's all these aid money coming in and like transforming the economy completely, which was also what happened a lot in Lebanon. So I was also referring to that and how it kind of shifts the subjectivity of like the subject, you know, and the desires that they are looking for in all of this. I think it's very obvious in all of your films as well, even at one point what Islam is saying about like we had this dream of liberating Palestine and now we want to become doctor, or, you know, like it really shifts. So yeah.
I want to actually, Islam messaged and said she also had a mistake the time difference.
Sure.
So yeah, she was outside of her house. But actually, like remarking on something that Islam said, like I remember, I mean, obviously we shot the film around the end of 2020. And that was not the same moment as the most recent kind of Palestinian, like the most recent events and the most recent protests that were happening after the attempted dispossession of Sheikh Jarrah. And so kind of even I remember, I mean, I'm not going to speak for Islam, but I remember that even Islam's rhetoric, like we talked about how when those events started taking place, we talked about how the sentiment that she embodies in the film is very different from like the sentiment that we all felt in what was it, like April. And how like in a way, like even in April, it felt like there was this opening up of history and there was this kind of like international movement, and it's international movement for solidarity, and it's very different from like the kind of tragic. When I say tragic, I don't mean tragic as in like very sad. I mean, tragic as in like kind of the genre of tragedy, like accounting for the movement of fate or something. Like it's different from that very tragic tone that she has in the film, where she's reflecting on this movement and like this kind of the changing of desire within amongst the Palestinians in Lebanon, and what they desire, what they think is like their long-term goal or long-term like an achievement they're aspiring towards. And she kind of says that when you have agency, and when you are positioned as an actor with agency, the kind of desires that you cultivate are very different from the ones you cultivate when you're in a position of kind of like, in a way, like very totalizing deadlock. And so I think, yeah, like it's kind of interesting to think that we shot that before the events, but then even that is subject to change. Like there's never, like even the pessimism or even the like the register of tragedy isn't stable. Like even that is subject to change on the way.
But I like this idea just more generally about, I mean, I want to imagine that I will be a doctor, even though that imagination is also impossible for a future. I mean, I read it and I was reading it more in there's a bit of an irony. So beginning, I mean, because we used to have this with my parents. My parents kept saying, we will move to the new house. We will move to the new house. This was I'm in the 80s and the 90s. And so we as me and my brothers and my sisters and also other like siblings, some people in my age group, friends of my parents, their sons and stuff like this. So we started to think, oh yeah, the house was like a joke, like Palestine. Like when we will be liberated. Yes, when we will be liberated, like we will have a house. So you mean you're trying to tell us we're not going to have a house, But then the irony is, because of Oslo, we did eventually get the house, right? But we're still struggling to get Palestine. And I don't know, I noted this a long time ago, but just to think about how privatized Palestine, well, I mean, let me speak specifically about the West Bank, and I think it's very similar maybe in Gaza, but how privatized everything has become in the occupied territories of the West Bank. Now all of our concerns is just to individually make sure that we're okay, because we don't know how to gather around as a collective. And I would say we are struggling from the inflation now of the dollar here, because also the Israeli shekel is doing so well, I mean this seriously, but the dollar isn't. But we are tied to the Israeli shekel. So this is also disorienting, right? This is a very disorienting feeling that you have when you're actually not able to address the issue. We can only speak about bank loans and houses and just how much bread you can get home. It's a very disorienting feeling. That's part of what I think neoliberalism does, and it makes it harder to have solidarity amongst each other and a common goal.
No, I was just noting, like, yes, it sounds also a lot like Beirut.
These regimes like to copy each other as well.
Yeah.
We wanted to open the question to the people who are listening. Thank you all for being here with us. I don't know if someone wants to ask something to Basma Alsharif, Bassem, Saad, or Shuruq, Harb. Is there any question? You can write it in the chat.
I think I'm not
sure. Or
sure.
maybe raise your hand to be unmuted.
Sure. Maybe there is no question. Let me try. something. Otherwise, we can continue as well. We have, I think, a couple of questions. Okay, so that's or type in the chat.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Yeah, everyone is able to see the answer from John. Like, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand or type in the chat. So, is there any question? Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, maybe we touched a lot upon that in the previous answers, but so in one of the sequence of your film, Bassem, of Congress of Ailing Persons, there's two characters of the film that are recalling different moments of the Lebanese October Revolution. And at some point, Rayan Abdel Khalik is talking about the Egg, which is a building located in downtown Beirut, whose construction was interrupted by the war, and which was reappropriated with many other places by the people during the revolution. So he recounts a techno rave that happened there, and also there was some professors and lecturers making sessions, and at one point they were interrupted by one of the revolutionaries that pointed like the incongruous of these sessions, where at the same time there was all these movements happening outside, sleepless nights, all these emergencies. So the response this person got was, what you're doing is necessary and right, but what we are doing, but what they're doing is also as necessary. So the question is, if you see that in some situation, be it like, for example, the past blast, the bankruptcy, at one point, like occupation or counter-revolution, there could be another response that could be said, and that we could reconfigure the way we understand priorities. It's a tricky question.
Yeah, very tricky.
But yeah, I think it could open the debate.
Like what kind of priority are you thinking of? Like what, like, do you mean like, I mean
yeah, I don't know, how do you understand urgencies or priorities, or you don't, or you have an absolute answer, or
yeah, I mean, it was like that. I've never, like, before, obviously, in Lebanon we had like the 2015 uprising, but it was like much like kind of smaller in size, and like for the previous kind of larger scale social movements, I was much younger in Lebanon. So this is this most recent, the Lebanese uprising, was like the main one that I lived in, that was like 3 months long, and like for 3 months kind of like most other activity was suspended in the country, and you kind of like started orienting your day around the events. Like, what is the schedule for today's like what schedule is are we following today? And in a lot of moments, like, I mean, and I think this is reflective of other kind of uprisings that happen in the rest of the world in the last few years. Like, there's obviously like a lot of them are very spontaneous. In Lebanon, like there aren't, let's say, like the labor unions, the other organizational structures for like negotiating workers' interests, or like populations that are disenfranchised. Like, there's very few organizing larger organizations or unions that are functioning. And so like there was no, which is different from, like, I guess I would say, other protests that happened in the Arab Spring, like maybe in Tunisia and Sudan. Like, there was more of like there were more syndicates or unions that could kind of dialogue with the movement on the streets, or try to create some kind of formalization of demand, or like, you know, like kind of seize power in different ways. In Lebanon, it was very like, there was also this rhetoric of being a leaderless movement, and like not wanting to elect leaders because there weren't any really. And no groups really could speak for sizable portions of the people in the streets. And so like it was spontaneous. I mean, of course, someone would say it was spontaneous to a fault. Like there wasn't really kind of guiding like collective groups that could channel the demands and kind of have a longer, more sustainable platform for any kind of change. Of course, then again, like that is the moment when things start to happen. Like after the protests, there were a lot of there are currently like some coalitions that have been on the verge of forming, but haven't really like coalesced into anything legible. But yeah, in terms of like those conflicts that were happening in the squares in Lebanon, like they come out of like just people being in the streets and trying to do what they think is the most urgent activity. Like the professors were doing teach-ins, and like other people were kind of, there was the women's, like the pacifist women's chain that kind of protects the protesters, or like there's a buffer zone between the protesters and the police. And it was just interesting to see all these like different types of people occupy the same space in a way that's very, they're very incommensurate. Like there's no way to reconcile these different stakeholders together. And so like there were a lot of these like very strange conflicts, especially with like some groups who joined the uprising but aren't really like, they're maybe some of them are a bit more sectarian than others. So these like the rhetorics that came out of the dissonance between the different groups was quite like, was something interesting. It also paints, I think, a more vivid picture of any kind of uprising. Like it's not a waving Lebanese flag or whatever. Like there's all of these different social actors in the same place.
Shuruq or Basma, do you want to add something? And again, if someone in the audience have a question, please raise your hand. We hope it's not too complicated to follow the debate without having seen the movie yesterday, for example. Maybe it's one of the reasons why we do not have questions. But yeah.
I wanted to ask Basma a question. I wanted you to say more about, I'm so curious. So what was the reaction you got once you said, well, part of me wants to bury this film and this is my reaction to it? Because I find it very interesting because I think there was I wouldn't say a trend, but there was like a big effort, I think, by several artists and institutions to try to restore some of the films that were lost, or even to access them. And so it's such an interesting reaction that you have. And maybe actually, like you were saying, maybe it's better this was gone, so I'm just curious about the reaction that you got.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think it is funny because the person who commissioned the work from so they were responsible. I guess London Palestine Film Festival had gotten money in order to restore these films and exhibit them. And there were, a number of them. And obviously there have been other people who have worked on this and toured with these films, I guess. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how extensive their restoration was, the London Palestine Film Festival. But I was also kind of wondering why they had asked me, because I think also as like knowing who I was or what my work is like, that I was like, but I'm not going to like put this on a platform or pedestal. Like I'm probably going to be critical of it because I have a lot of questions about whether the weight of our history is allowing us to move forward or if it's really just holding us back. And which is not to say that you can erase history ever. And of course it has value, but at what point does this like valorized history become problematic and become also painting a portrait of something that it wasn't real. I mean, also having people in my family who are PFLP and like hearing their stories and recognizing like this wasn't the, you know, I mean, of course I'm proud of it, but I'm also like proud of that, not just my family, but like that part of our history, but I'm also aware of like how much bigger I think it was represented as being, like as a real thing that was like resisting or had any power. I think that's naive, and I think even they realized that, you know, people who were active, is like we were up against a force that was far more modern, that we understood, that had far more like time to develop itself and organize itself, and we're like flies, you know, we're just a needle in a haystack in comparison to the power. And I think that's very common in all kind of like it's the same I think in Egypt. It's like I think we all felt very proud about what we saw happening in Egypt, even if we're not Egyptian or living there, because it represented this just like, oh, finally, you know, like you can somehow shake things, you know. And so I felt like confused why I was being asked to engage with that material, because I thought like, but you are making an effort to do something that probably does need to be done, but if, you know, if I'm going to engage with it, I'm going to be critical. And I didn't know exactly what I would do. This is before I chose Qassem's film even. And when I made the work, the person who had commissioned it said like, I'm not sure if we're going to show it to Qassem, because all the filmmakers were still alive that people had worked with their projects. And I was like, oh, with their films. And I was like, okay, but I would be curious, you know, if you heard it, if you did, you know, show it to him what he would think. And eventually I did hear that like he wasn't thrilled.
Yeah, what happened?
Yeah, he didn't. I mean, I think he wasn't part of the festival where it's screened, but he was not like, he was kind of like, oh, this kind of work, like, you know, experimental, like, all right. Like I would have liked it if it had been more documentary, which I mean, yeah. In all fairness, yes. I mean, the film is good. Like if we just talk about it objectively, I think it's a very good film, Qassem's film, and probably what he sees happening to his film is like not great, or what? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how he perceives it, and I was never actually in touch with him because I felt like the person mediating that was like, I don't know that it's that we want. Like there was an idea that he would be at the screening of the film, and then we would have a conversation, and that went out the window very quickly once they saw what I was doing. But I think that's okay. Also, I think it's like you know, I think other people have had issues with the work, or that it's also like a bit what is the word, like when you're like mustafiz, what's that word, like
provocative, or
yeah, provocative maybe in a cheap way even, you know, that it's like this thing of like just, you know, images that are kind of mustafizin. Yeah, I forgot what your question was.
You mean annoying, right? مش بس, not just provocative, but like annoyed, like by the that's what that's
exactly. Yeah. But like, oh, okay, like, you know, but like, why not just respect this film that was made and its value and all these things? And for me, it's still not okay. I think that we're like, we often, like, I often feel like we return to this moment of like just kind of cliched hope, like what you're saying with the house, you know, like this, like we still have hope in something, even if like the eventual prize is not that great, actually. Like what is it that we're fighting for? What is it that we are going to get in the end? I think like, so being aware of like the kind of imagery that incites like, you know, action, like what its power is actually like, it's just, for me, there's no answer. Like, I don't know. It's very questionable, but in relation to places who have had conflict for a long time, I mean, in Lebanon included, I don't think Lebanon, it's like the conflict began 2 years ago. It's been, it's kind of like, oh, we're adding this shit on top of like decades of shit, you know, like, and I think we relate to that as well. Just like for me, seeing what was happening in Lebanon, I was like, I don't even know how to imagine what this feels like, because it's like, how do you deal with this as if it's happening, as if it's the only thing that's happening now, as if it's not built on a legacy of corruption and problems. And so I don't know. I feel like the reaction also, I think for my film is also very varied across the board, like where it's shown. And I have often been like worried about its screening without having an opportunity to explain what the film is, because I think the first place it screened was in New York. And I felt like audiences were a bit like, what? You know, and feeling like there was something really anti-Semitic about it, or something very, you know, which for me was shocking. But yeah, I don't know. It's tricky, but I was also really glad to be given the opportunity to work with that material, because it's something that I think even for me was something I was trying to avoid. Like, I don't want to deal with this kind of archival material. Like, I deal with archives a lot, but not something that I think is held up on such a high pedestal in our history. And so it was a really productive challenge, I think, for me to like engage with the material and force myself to really like, what is it that I think it's doing, and how can I enact that and make it a visceral experience?
Because I think part of it is like, I mean, if we just to tie it into the questions that we were asked before in the event, in terms of like how, you know, revolutions build and they take time. And so I think in a way, if we don't have an opportunity to kind of question those moments and to question those images, then actually we're not moving forward, and we are being besieged by them, quite literally. Because we're not learning, and we're not learning, and we're choosing again to hide behind an illusion rather than actually deal with the reality. And I think, you know, a revolution can only remain successful. I mean, because I also like the other line in your film that where she says, "I'm always going to be against," right? That she doesn't see an end necessarily. So she's aware that this is a continuous effort. You know, that comes with existence. And so, yeah, and I think that if you don't revisit and you don't learn, then actually you're just perpetuating falsehood and escapism also. Because there's a nostalgia that's comfortable, that, you know, around this kind of like militant cinema. That in a way, by revisiting it kind of makes our struggle quite simple in terms of understanding it as either we resist in this way or we don't at all. And reality is that actually resistance takes on a lot. It's very painful, and it's an everyday practice. That each one of us, I would say, wherever we're living, I mean, in Lebanon, Palestine, also even Egypt, I mean, it's a consistent effort. It's not just a thing that you decide one day, and it doesn't take one form, and it doesn't have one image.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Bassem, if you wanted to answer, but just also, Basma, you explained, like, you talked about the screening of your movie and the fact that it's work that you like to discuss, and it's important that it's contextualized also. So just it gives me also the opportunity to answer a question by Charbel, who is in the chat, where the question is, so if there will be an online screening of the film. So just to make it clear, that we actually yesterday had the screening of the films in Paris and in Beirut. So it's like we decided, it was organized in 2 cities, and on the meantime, it was difficult to organize a panel directly after the screening in both of the cinema in the 2 cities. So we decided to organize a panel online the day after the screening. So the strange thing is that some people have seen the movie without seeing the conversation following the screening, and other people are now listening to the panel without having the possibility to see the films. But that's the reason why we decided to ask to the filmmakers if they wanted to share a clip of their work at the beginning of the panel. I don't know if there is another question from the audience. I think if there is no more question, we can maybe stop now the meeting. I don't know if you would like to add something.
I have nothing more, but I really appreciate this program and the whole all the events. I have to say, I think it's really nice to see this kind of work placed together and in relation to Palestine, and not have it be kind of the expected nationalistic sort of like I don't know, like conversation, let's say. Like, it's really good to have this kind of more complex and unanswerable discourse around what's happening in various places, clearly not just Palestine, and to have it shift away also from only being about Palestine, as Shuruq was saying, as being seen like as the essential conflict. I think it's really good that we start to see that the connections and the kind of like also the visual languages that are being developed. And like, I mean, I know Shuruq, but I don't know Bassem, but it's so interesting like how there's the overlap and the issues being dealt with. And it'll be interesting to see in 10 years, like what that looks like, I think, as we look back on this moment and hopefully are out of the shit that we're in, maybe. Yeah, thank you so much.
No, it really is a pleasure. And yeah, I'm just like still really intrigued by the overlaps in the visual languages, as you said, and like kind of thinking of like, I think all three films, like, sure, they're tackling like these much larger historical and political subjects, but the way they kind of work within somehow like a queer festival is kind of like how they're thinking of leisure and everyday pleasure, and how that kind of is in antagonism or in direct conversation with capital H history, which I think was really interesting. But yeah, it was so nice to be in conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I second that, and thank you so much for putting this together, because it just shows that the effort is humongous. And yeah, I second everything that they already said and say thank you.
Yes, so from the Queer Film Festival, sorry, for the Toronto.
Okay, we need to thank John, who is beside the screen, TQFF, and it's Toronto Queer Film Festival, and is helping us with the Zoom.
Yeah, so we're just reiterating that, so the Queer Cinema for Palestine is happening online and in person until November 20. So you can see actually many films and panels online on demand. If you go to torontoqueerfilmfest.com/QCP, so you can see that. I think you received it in the chat. So I'll encourage you to do that. And I want to thanks again all the filmmakers for their times and for the film that we were able to show. Really, thank you very much. And yeah.
Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you.
Who were listening, who were with us tonight. Bye.
Bye. Thank you again. Bye-bye.